In this episode, I explain how the Boston Celtics are going to outsmart the new collective bargaining agreement. All teams operate on a timeline. It's usually between 5 to 7 years. But after the implementation of the NBA's new collective bargaining agreement, and especially the new draft pick penalty, higher spending teams are going to be forced to operate on at least an 8-year timeline. Now, before I go into that, I'm going to quickly pivot to provide some additional context. Now, as many of you know, there are 5 relevant spending levels: the minimum team salary, the salary cap, the luxury tax line, and then the apron, which is broken into the first apron and the second apron. And how you calculate team salary changes based upon the level. Now, going back to the topic at hand, beginning in the 24-25 season, if a team's salary is above the second apron as of their last regular season game, they will not be allowed to trade their first round draft pick in the draft 7 seasons away. That's the pick they can't access yet, so it's guaranteed to still be in their possession. So if a team is over the second apron in the 24-25 season, that means their 2032 first round pick becomes frozen. They can't trade it completely, they can't trade it with conditions, they can't even swap it. It's frozen and untradeable. But that frozen draft pick status can almost be viewed as an interim status, because depending on how they operate over the next 4 seasons will determine what actually happens to that draft pick. There are 2 paths from that point forward. The first path is if that team finishes over the second apron in at least 2 of the next 4 seasons, then that frozen pick will be subject to what's called the draft pick penalty. So in addition to it being untradeable, it will also be pushed to the very back of that year's first round, meaning it will now become the number 30th pick in that year's draft. Now, if multiple teams are subject to that penalty, then they're essentially grouped together and then they select in reverse order of their winning percentage. So say if 2 teams are both subject to that draft pick penalty, the team with the worst record would select number 29 and the team with the better record would select number 30th. And the second path is that if that team only finishes over the second apron in 1 or none of the next 4 seasons, then that pick is completely restored. It's not frozen, it's not untradeable, it's not moved to the back of the draft. It just reverts back to a normal pick. So here's an example of how that could work. If a team is over the second apron in the 24-25 season, and then they're not over the apron in the 25-26 season, the 26-27 season, and the 27-28 season, that would mean that they would be compliant regardless of how they operate in the 4th season, which would be the 28-29 season. So the day following the last day of the 27-28 regular season, their 2032 first round pick would unfreeze and would be eligible for them to trade it if they so wished. Therefore, right now, a team could essentially be over the second apron for 3 years in a row and be completely unpunished. Year 1 would be this season, the 23-24 season. Well, if they're over the second apron, the rule hasn't taken effect yet, so they would be fine. In the 24-25 season, if they're over the second apron, that would freeze their 2032 pick. And then it would be based upon what happens over the next 4 seasons, the 25-26, the 26-27, the 27-28, and the 28-29 seasons. And then in the 25-26 season, if they again went over the apron, that would then freeze their 2033 pick and count as 1 strike against their frozen 2032 pick. However, if they then stay below the second apron for the next 3 seasons, which would be the 26-27 season, the 27-28 season, and the 28-29 season, both of those frozen picks, the 2032 frozen pick and the 2033 frozen pick, would both unfreeze and neither of them would be subject to the draft pick penalty, where that pick would be moved to the end of the first round. Now let me walk you through Boston's plan. Boston's currently all in, having built one of the best starting 5s we've seen in a long time. But they have a clear window and timeline for how long they can keep this core together while still having the flexibility to navigate around the NBA's new penalties. See, teams can live with the draft pick freezing, but they definitely do not want to incur the draft pick penalty and see their draft pick pushed to the back of the draft. That punishment is very severe, especially when it's so far out, because you can't predict what position your team's going to be in at that time. So what's Boston doing? Well, in the 23-24 season, Boston's trending to be a second apron team. In the 24-25 season, they're also projected to be a second apron team next year, depending on what Jrue Holiday's salary is. If he picks up his $39.4 million player option, then yeah, they'll be over the second apron again. Although he could opt out and extend, and at that point, it would depend on what his new salary would be. But Boston's aware that they could end up being over the second apron again, which would freeze their 2032 pick. And then in the 25-26 season, they could end up being over the second apron yet again. Now, that would depend on what they do with Jrue Holiday's contract and what contract Derek White gets, who will be 31 going into that season. And if that happens, they'll then have two frozen draft picks, one in the 2032 draft and one in the 2033 draft. And to restore them, what they'll need to do is stay under the second apron for the next 3 seasons, which is exactly when Kristaps Porzingis' contract falls off their books and provides them some additional flexibility. Now let's look at another team. The Clippers are also in a very interesting position when it comes to all this. This season, in the 23-24 season, the Clippers are projected to be a second apron team. They're currently not locked into being a second apron team for any future season, but they also have a lot of looming decisions that could quickly change that. If Kawhi Leonard and Paul George both get max extensions, and Russell Westbrook and PJ Tucker both pick up their player options, they'd only be $22 million below the second apron next season without factoring in James Harden. And based on what the Clippers gave up in terms of draft capital to get James Harden, I think it's pretty safe to assume they're prepared to pay him. So when you factor in Paul George, Norman Powell, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, and Kawhi Leonard, the Clippers could find themselves over the second apron for several seasons to come, putting their long-term draft assets at risk very quickly. Even though Steve Ballmer may be okay to keep spending to no end, from a roster building perspective, I don't think it's in their best interest to keep going over that second apron, especially when it's going to impact their future draft picks all the way out to 2032 and 2033. So based on that, I think it'll be very interesting to see what kind of contracts Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, and James Harden are signed to, because it may not only affect the next couple of years, but it could potentially affect the next decade for the Los Angeles Clippers.